Hello everyone, my name is Simon Bird. I'm a consultant and a coach, and I work with organisations, teams and individuals on a one-to-one basis on areas such as culture, change and leader development. At least half of my work is with the NHS, and so right now, of course, I'm talking with lots of people from every corner of the service and hearing their stories about how they are managing in these COVID times. One recurring theme has really been around leading from home. How can you do that? What's different and what should you pay attention to? So I have some thoughts here over the next few minutes, which I'm offering as a helpful resource. But of course, as for everyone, just do what you can. The world is quite odd for most people at the moment. So what is the leadership challenge or the job when the team you are asked to lead are suddenly all at home? The COVID-19 climate is one in which leaders in different contexts are facing very different demands. We know that many clinical leaders are working in frontline roles now and drawing on every ounce of their experience, skills and education to deliver the best they can to each patient they treat. Yet other leaders are finding themselves overnight required to lead a team that is entirely home-based, some of whom they may not even know. So on the surface, this might seem like it can't be that difficult or different, but I think that would be a mistake. As an article in the Harvard Business Review points out, there are more than 10,000 books in the English language on Amazon on virtuality and how to lead remotely at a distance. Well, why is this? The reason, of course, is that it is very difficult. So what are the most important things to pay attention to from a leadership perspective? The first of these, clarity. When people are at home or away from a conventional work environment, they need clarity from you as the leader more than ever. Specifically, they want clarity around their roles and their goals. Has anything changed? What do you need from them by when? They also need clarity around boundaries and controls. How far can they go? Who signs off on things? Have any of these things changed? David Rock has done a lot of work around what he calls neuro leadership. And he talks about how our brains are generally wired to perceive threat. And one of the things that causes our brains to create a threat response is uncertainty or lack of clarity. And when we have a threat response, that means our primitive brain becomes more dominant. And when we talk about primitive brain, we're talking about fight or flight. So in a work context, this can manifest itself as withdrawal, defensive behavior, or seeing threat where there is none, and its deterioration in our ability to assess a situation accurately. So the leader's job here is to try and answer as many questions as possible and reduce uncertainty wherever they can. So what can you do now? Well, first of all, think about each person in your team. Have you had a one-to-one conversation to confirm or reconfirm these things with them? It would be risky to assume that the people in your team all know that everything is the same or know about the changes that are required. Secondly, are you doing everything you can to help reduce uncertainty, specifically uncertainty? People are hungry for information, so almost anything you can tell them is helpful, even if you think it may be small or insignificant. The second thing to pay attention to is, of course, communication. People very quickly feel cut off from the resources, information, or relationships they need to do their jobs well. You'll probably need to communicate even more than you think, especially if the team in question is new, or perhaps being put together for a very specific short or medium-term purpose, like supporting a COVID-19 activity stream. When thinking about communication, leaders need to think about it in terms of frequency, but also be prepared for the content, which may be more challenging than normal. So what might this look like? Leaders could help their team establish a rhythm in the day. To do this, they could learn from the way agile teams work and have the equivalent of stand-up meetings, though you don't have to stand up. In agile methodology, teams check in with each other briefly at the beginning of each day. This simple act helps create structure in a working day. Team members also say what they're aiming to do that day, and this helps create some accountability within the team. and actually for the team member in question. Yet leaders should also remember this is not a 9-to-5 territory anymore. So agreeing when this would work for a team is an important conversation to have. And on that note, leaders might want to think in advance about how they discuss issues like children and childcare. As the Harvard Business Review writes, the blurring of boundaries between work and home has suddenly come upon us. So managers have got to develop the skills and policies to support their teams. This might involve being more flexible about the hours in which employees work. You don't have to eat lunch at 12 p.m. You might walk your dog at 2 p.m. Things are much more fluid, and managers just have to trust that employees will do their best to get their work done. Note that word trust, we'll be coming back to it. So what can you do in this area? Well, importantly, keep the lines of communication open, honest, and broad. Send emails or post videos about your reasoning, intentions, and expectations. Make it easy for your team to know your thoughts and contribute their own. Prepare to talk about issues beyond the obvious work progress subjects, and think about how flexible you're prepared to be. And importantly, your team also needs to hear from you to maintain their trust in leadership per se. The third area to really pay attention to is clumsily called individualization. It's a given that good leaders will know their individual team members separately. They know how to get the best out of their team members as individuals, how much clarity they need, how confident they feel in their strengths. When the team is remote and operating via Zoom and email, leaders will need to consciously think even more about the individual needs of their people. Leaders have to work even harder here, as they generally have lost all the body language cues they might normally have been able to pick up, and if they're lucky, are restricted to a headshot. Whether it's Zoom, WebEx, Google Hangouts, or Microsoft Teams, video conferencing and our take-up of it means it's unlikely we'll ever go back to things how they were before. And there are lots of upsides to the use of this technology. One of these is the democratization of meetings. There's a certain equity achieved by everyone having a headshot of the same size. And if you're leading the meeting, you suddenly have an enormous amount of power with the ability to mute participants and steer the direction of the meeting in a way that's very different to a physical meeting. However, don't confuse this with the idea that each of these people might not need something very different from you. The virtual meeting is only the start. Leaders should expect to check in with individuals as well to understand individual needs, as well as building a discreet relationship so team members still feel valued and heard. So what can you do now? Well, make sure you ask each team member to describe the conditions under which they perform best, and ask directly how they're managing the practical things which working from home brings with it. So what else? Beyond the essential hooks of clarity, communication, and individualization, which are the areas for rapid attention, I'd suggest, and they are areas in which you can do things tomorrow, leaders, as always, face the very challenge of being the leader. This is tough, especially when you don't feel like being the leader at all. So each leader, you may have your own anxieties and concerns about your own families, your jobs, your health, their colleagues, and maybe society more broadly. All of this will be a mirror of how their teams will be feeling. As Fast Company writes this month, outside of your role as a leader, you can and should feel whatever you need to feel. But in your role as a leader, you will best serve your team by being a voice of reason and calm. The more you can show up from a place of empathy, respect, understanding, and peace, the more those under your leadership will have the ability to calm themselves and to do their work. So beyond the very tactical things and action-focused areas which you can work in now, there's quite an interesting area to consider if you have the headspace to do that. And I think that is around whether virtual work is simply the next step in the evolution of the workplace. One of the many great resources that has become available free is a series of webinars made available by the London Business School, Leading in a Pandemic, and I will reference those at the end of this little chat. In one of those, Linda Grattan, Professor of Management Practice at the London Business School, talks about this very issue. She frames the current home working as a mass experiment, which you would never normally be allowed to do, which in effect makes up the third wave of virtual working. And she talks about how the first wave was actually back in the 1980s when very large home computers began to appear in some people's homes. However, she notes that even during wave one in the 1980s, when independent consultants were pioneers in terms of technology, they quite soon began to worry about not being part of a community, which is the social element she references in each wave she describes. Now, this is significant beyond somebody just liking to be with people. Because what happens when we don't bump into people, questions get raised about how do we pick up the tacit knowledge, those things you pick up by osmosis, by chatting with people in the corridor. This is a real challenge to any leader, because this kind of information is like the cement between the building bricks of policy, projects and work streams. And perhaps as this lockdown and this pandemic continues to develop, and we spend longer working in environments that are relatively new to many people, this may become more and more of an issue and become more pronounced. So the social element provides a real challenge to the leaders. On the one hand, there is the individual social needs of an individual, but tacit knowledge is also all the soft data that doesn't get written down by a team or organization. For example, the stories, the legends, and the myths, and perhaps importantly, how to get things done. These are all examples of tacit knowledge, and they don't get written down. When organizations and teams talk about knowledge management, they're not only talking about the official, explicit knowledge. If anything, tacit knowledge is even more valuable because it's not written down. So how can a leader hope to replicate any of this? Well, our last visit to the Harvard Business Review resources, again, available free during these pandemic times, raises an interesting question around this. People lose the unplanned water cooler or cappuccino conversations with colleagues in remote work. These are actually big and important parts of the workday that have a direct impact on performance. How do we create these virtually? For some groups and individuals, it will be constant instant messaging. For others, it will be live phone conversations or video conferences. Some people might want to use WhatsApp, WeChat, or Viber. The manager can encourage these types of contact points for psychological health. People are not going to be able to figure these things out organically. You've got to coach them. And I think that last phrase, you've got to coach them, is an interesting one for leaders to consider. As different platforms bubble up and we experiment with different things, I wonder if the leader also has a role of instilling confidence and practice around using different platforms and different channels of communication. That is something that will be new to working in this way. So where does that leave us as we come to a close here? I wonder if remote leadership and working remotely, working and leading people scattered through their homes might require a changing mindset. Leadership is always about people, yet the leadership role may be changing shape to focus even more forensically on how the leader not only operates with individual members of their team, but is also required to create that space in which the team can operate, albeit virtually and using different technological opportunities. Leaders may need to be more mindful or intentional about how they're going to communicate with their team. They can't rely anymore on bumping into people in corridors or sticking their head into a nearby office or asking someone to drop in. They will need to be more planful about what they want to say and also consider the impact they want it to have, as if they can deliver it on the phone or on Zoom. This kind of leadership remains people-centric, yet it is also measured, thoughtful, and empathetic. This will be a challenge for those who really thrive on organisational drama and rushing around corridors and organisations. That drama will still be there, but they might have to work harder to find it. Let's look at one last fantastic resource that I was able to look at as I pulled these thoughts together. And this was the Sloan Management Review, again, March 2020. And in the MIT Sloan Management Review, they take a step away from COVID-19 specifically and look more generally at crisis management. And they look at three particular areas where leaders and organizations can act to drive actually even higher performance from teams. The first of these was adaptive capacity. So leaders needing to be able to respond and move as a situation changes rapidly, yet also maintain some kind of stability or anchoring where it is possible. This anchoring can take the shape of consistency, by which I mean, if, for example, your organization proclaims that people come first, ensure that all of your decisions in this time reflect that. Support people who make decisions using these principles, even if there are short-term financial consequences. Value contributions no matter who offers them. This is no time for politics. The second element they highlight is resilience. Interesting question. Is this actually an opportunity to rally your team in these adverse circumstances? To talk about how you may all emerge stronger, more engaged and more capable than before. This would require leaders to reassure and encourage people, and then supporting them both at work and at home. And the third element, which is highlighted in the article, is trust. That word that featured quite early on in my talk with you here. This idea of trust takes us back to where we started in our discussions around virtual working and how to lead effectively and give your teams what they need. Linda Grattan from London Business School addresses this issue by recalling how the main blockers to virtual and home working taking off initially were the leaders and bosses themselves. Fundamentally, they didn't believe that people at home were working. Deep down, they thought they were skiving. So, however, the mass experiment in home working, she also refers to this as a leveler. Now those same leaders and bosses are finding themselves also doing it, and presumably not all skiving all of the time. So for leaders to truly trust their people at a deep level may be a challenge to some. And so to conclude this piece, Grattan offered a mantra from one of her clients, which was to trust someone until they become trustworthy. I beg your pardon, untrustworthy. This may feel aspirational, and yet during COVID-19, convention and tradition is being broken everywhere. What was impossible is now possible. And so the questions for leaders as new habits form must surely include, how can I help my team be even better than they were before? What do I need to do? And how might I need to think and be? I'll leave you with a set of references which I drew on to pull these thoughts together. One of the upsides of these strange times is there is an enormous amount of very high quality resource and writing being produced by some very, very high quality journals. And that is all free and available, and I hope continue to interest you and perhaps inspire you. The best of luck with whatever you're doing at the moment.